Excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nandini Ramanujam. Like Chris Reagan, I'm an economist, but I have the privilege of co-directing the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism at the Faculty of Law, where Pearl Eliadis is a full member. And it is a pleasure to be part of this workshop. I have the privilege of moderating a panel which pushes the conversation on dignity beyond courts. And it is, dignity, as Pearl said, is at the heart of this conversation, the panel entitled Human Rights and Human Impact. So what is this dignity, which is invoked by all? All human beings have intrinsic inherent dignity. The notion of dignity is foundational to, as mentioned earlier, to the international human rights corpus, regional human rights systems, and domestic human rights framework. I'm not going to talk much about dignity because we have an expert on this panel as a discussant who will elaborate on some of these ideas. At the heart of this conversation are two concepts: subjective dignity and relational dignity. And so with that in mind, I'll invite our first speaker, Mohammed Hashim, who is the Executive Director of Canadian Race Relations Foundation. His bio could be found in the conference program, so I'm not going to read out full bios of our speakers, but Mohammed has worked as a labor organizer and human rights advocate for over a decade. He has dedicated his career to supporting equity, inclusion, and community empowerment. And Mohammed is going to speak, I think, from the perspective of individuals who face exclusion, who suffer indignity, and discrimination. So it is very much from the subjective side of the discourse, individuals' perspective, and particularly marginalized individuals. So I'll invite Mohammed to come to the podium, and you have about 12 to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, it's an honor to be here, so I greatly appreciate the invitation. So thank you, Pearl and McGill, for having me here. I'm actually here with a bunch of my colleagues. I want to acknowledge Angela Lee, who is our Director of Partners, Neil Santamaria, who's our Quebec office director, and Geneviève Delphine Mercier, who's the manager in Quebec over here for our programs. Let me introduce myself. My name is Mohammed Hashim. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. I'm not sure if you've heard of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. We're a federal crown corporation. We exist out of an apology. We were born out of an apology, and we live as a promise from a community. So during World War II, Japanese Canadians were interned. Their possessions were taken. Their homes were sold. They were put into internment camps, and after the war, sent away. In the 80s, the government apologized to the community, and through that apology, there was a redress agreement that was a founding document that created the Canadian Race Relations Foundation as a crown corporation within the Department of Canadian Heritage, within the federal government. I'm going to actually zoom out a little bit before talking about the individual, because I think that the context matters as well. There's a number of things that we've heard so far in terms of the right to be offended and more. But I think that there's a number of factors that we also need to think about, because the landscape that we're working around right now is not the landscape that we've had, 30, 40 years ago or 50 years ago. It's significantly different. Anybody can put up anything online, and that could go spread really, 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 really quickly. In fact, like when we talk about takedown laws and what takedown laws could potentially look like, the fact is, like, within 24 hours, the damage of what's need to be done is already done. and peeling that back, no matter how fast any system or any social media company or whatever it might come to be, like peeling that back is going to be near impossible, just because the mechanisms that convey such sentiments and the methodology by which those sentiments are selected to expand as quick as they do through algorithms to be able to see what is most insightful, what's most catchy, and the virality of information is changing the landscape by which we need to be also looking at the determination of harm. And I think that that's a really critical factor, because in this environment, we don't have people who are fact-checking things. We don't have news that is just consistently, there's a fairness, there's an expectation of truth. I don't know if we have a fair expectation of truth to be found online anymore. Do we think that what we read online is actually true or factual? I don't know. I know that when I talk to parents who, I have a 9-year-old and I have nieces and nephews, and we're talking about, do we give our 13-year-old a cell phone? And you gulp when you think about giving that kid a cell phone, because you don't know what they're going to see, what they're that level of freedom that we're going to give and put in their hands. What are the consequences that they're going to have to ensure? Because even when we talk about what's available online, and particularly when we did a survey a little while ago in terms of understanding online harms, 18 to 29-year-olds, almost 80% of them had seen something hateful, harmful, or harassment, or even violent extremism online within the last year. 80% of people have been exposed to that between 18 and 29. So the environment that we're looking at is extremely polluted. I'll give you a quick example. We get briefed by the RCMP relatively once in a while, frequently sometimes, and others less so. But we were getting briefed on the IMVE, which is violent extremism, work that's happening over there, and we were looking at instant messaging applications, so WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and whatnot. We can name those few, but in Canada existing right now, there's about 72 of them, 72 instant messaging apps. They know that the replacement time. So if you find a messaging app that is a hate group that is expressing really hateful, harmful things, and it gets understood that by the platform that this needs to be taken down, the replacement time to go from one platform to the next platform is about 20 minutes. So we've calculated the speed by which, getting moved over from one platform to the next platform for an organized hate group is now. So it's so fluid and easy, and that just tells you the speed by which this thing is moving is significantly high. The federal government is looking at a number of initiatives. Obviously, there's a significant amount of conversation around online harms and safety and cyberbullying, and on the sharing of unconsensual images, or even terrorism and hate. And I think that there are new boundaries being drawn right now, particularly because we know that the room is almost lost, that the fire hose of hateful information that's out there is going and spreading so quickly that society needs to pull back a little bit and to figure out what are the new determining boundaries and goalposts of a conversation that should be allowed online. Because right now I don't think we really have any. There's a number of other things that are coming up right now. There's there's a combating action plan on the Canadian action, the name change is the Canadian Action Plan on Combating Hate, which is coming up relatively soon. Ontario is creating an anti-hate plan. Many of these different pieces that are happening right now are in response to the fact that people feel, particularly in governments, that the ground by which we are actually operating on is one, as I said before, is a place where the sense of expectation of fairness and equality in the online space is being lost. I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about, much of the work that we do is I go across this country and I meet with different community groups. So, when I get to I was in Halifax a little while ago, and we met with different community groups. And so I would go around to meet with like the Jewish Federation, the Muslim community groups, Black community groups, Asian community groups, to find out like, how are they experiencing hate. I always ask them a number of questions. Do your members face hate? Many of them say yes. Do you report to the police? Most of them say no. Maybe the Jewish community more so reports to the police because they have more established relationships, and because they have more institutional organization. And I asked them why do people not report it to the police? The most obvious response that I get is because we don't think anything's going to happen from that. I asked them, do you have any services that help community members? If you have no expectation of there being any remedy from the harm that you've faced, what do you do for your people? And typically the response is, well, we don't really have anything for that either. So what happens to people who are facing hate and discrimination? We're like, well, they just kind of eat it. And then sometimes when we talk about going to the police, there's not really a fair expectation that the police will either believe them, take what they're saying with a sense of duty, or sometimes just the fear of saying, this is just gonna re-victimize me and it's gonna be traumatic and why bother? And I think that says significance because, when we look at the sheer volume of things, and Stats Canada had a stat where they said 233,000 people self-reported had, faced some level of hate. I'm sure the definition of what they are reporting against is not the legal definition, so I don't think that the number holds true to the legal format of understanding hate. But 233,000 people through the General Social Survey on Victimization said that they had faced some form of hate. But only 3,000 people actually reported to the police. The number that police say that have been hate incidences or hate crimes is about 3,000 last year. It fluctuates a little bit up and down, and I think that that shows you that the gap between what people are experiencing and what is actually going to the criminal justice system is so massive that it's maybe 1.5% at best that people are reporting it at to the police. And even when there's when people do report it and it gets and that it goes to trial. And I'll give you an example. There was a Black Muslim woman in Toronto who was coming down an elevator and she was a social worker, and she sees another woman getting attacked, so she intervenes. And then the attacker goes at her, tears off her hijab, punches her, says Islamophobic things, racist as well as sexist things, while beating her up. He gets charged with assault. At the sentencing, the judge says yes, it was hate motivated, and therefore added that to the sentencing provisions. The person walked away with 2 years of parole. But the victim in her victim impact story said, and I'm going to read you a few of her quotes. This is from her victim impact statement. She says, she is on guard and cautious in case she's in danger again. She is now more attentive to her surroundings and is more paranoid than something like this will ever happen again. She feels her voice was taken away from me, that if I were to speak up, there would be horrible consequences for standing up. I am an outspoken person. I don't feel like I can be myself since. She does not feel comfortable helping people much, and she had to step back from her community work because she didn't feel comfortable being around so many people. The fact that this happened in the privacy of her own home, it makes me more cautious and scared to do community work in my neighborhood. The consequences are real. So what happens to her? Who helps her? Who helps her get back up? And so that's why earlier this year, Angela had worked with PwC to create a report on victims services. And we looked across this country to see, okay, well, if we don't have a great sense of faith in the criminal justice system being able to help people feel whole again, and the human rights communities, like tribunals and commissions, are looking seemingly scaling back and that access to a remedy. How do we actually assist people to feel whole again? And so we came up with a number of recommendations. One was in response to like the work that we've done touring this country and finding out what's actually available, creating funds from the federal and the provincial levels so that social service agencies can create victims of hate and specialized supports. Because if you have somebody walking with you through this journey of having to report to the police or doing a complaint, filing a complaint, the road seems more accessible. Because right now, just doing it alone seems so isolating and hard and challenging that most people just don't even bother. So if we were to create services across this country that people could have access to have somebody walk with you, to journey with, through this attainment of a remedy or a sense of justice, to create a fund for victims of hate to be able to access in order for them to access services that are not currently covered through other provincial benefits, to create a national hub that could work with victim service organizations, because this area is relatively new and there's not that much happening in terms of victims of hate specialized services, social services. There's other countries like Germany and others that have much more mature systems in this, and we've looked at those systems to say here's how you respond. So being able to create a national hub to upscale the working environment and training of those who are working in this environment to be able to assist them. And the last thing is that there's a role for municipalities to respond too. We look at London, Ontario. In the aftermath, we heard from the mosque that the police were there for 6 weeks, 2 months afterwards, doing were there for Friday prayers, and after that they disappeared, and people felt relatively abandoned. Kids in the school who were friends with with one of the girls who was murdered are still feeling trauma a year from there, because somebody who they knew personally, and the supports that were available to them was just left to the mosque and the school themselves to go sort themselves out. I think that municipalities can play a role in helping service those communities in moments like that. And the last thing I'm gonna end by is, before I end, I just we talk about the law enforcement's ability to do this work, and it's difficult. I chair a national task force with the RCMP where we've brought together to be honest, the best hate crimes investigators and prosecutors across this country to create national standards on hate crimes. And it's insanely complex, because the work that first of all, I agree that it's under-resourced. There's maybe 24 police forces that have dedicated hate crime units. The training of this environment is abysmal. I'll give you an example. One municipality we were working with last year had 15 hate incidences reported. This year, they created a hate crimes unit, and then they trained all their frontline officers and intake and phone intake people. And that number went from 15 to 200 and something by the beginning of October. That's a huge escalation. It's not like there's an explosion of hate in that municipality. It's that the cops were able to do their jobs better because they had the resources and the training to be able to do it. So the system is responding to certain levels, but it's a long, long road, and to create political will in environments and policing is a bit of a challenge. And the last thing I want to just say is that when we talk about victims and the right to be offended, I was in Quebec City the day after the massacre, so I met people outside that mosque. I looked at bloody carpets and bullet holes, and I met many people who were impacted by that. And there was a 6-year-old girl who was in the mosque that night, who, when the gunman came in, saw him shoot her father in the back while he was praying. The men at the back saw what was happening and saw the little girl who was running around and jumped on top of her to shield her from bullets. And when the gunman turned to her and pulled the trigger, he ran out of bullets. I think when we talk about what's inciting hate and what's available in the environment and what the real life consequences are, I don't think that's the same as being offended. As being offended, I think the level of violence that's happening across this country and the world, the level of instability that is being created because of the pollution of this environment is so high, and the victims that are being created are real. And I think that we need to take I think we need to put them at the center of this conversation. Many a times we think about, how do we protect what's on paper? But I think I want to see how we protect those who are impacted the most. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that. And it's about real people, harm caused to individuals, and their respect and dignity. And I invite our own Niemi to continue the conversation. Fo does not need an introduction, but for those of you who do not know who he is, he's the executive director of the Center for Research Action on Race Relations. It's a Montreal-based not-for-profit, actively engaged since '83. It says your bio in public education, training, and assistance for victims of racial and other forms of discrimination. And Fo has been, since '83, for at least law students from our faculty, has been a mentor. Year after year, many students do a legal clinic with CRAR and learn a great deal about the Montreal landscape and discrimination and hate crime in Montreal. So thank you for that, Fo, and over to you for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very, very important event. Before I start, I just want to, first of all, acknowledge the fact that my presentation today is about the people, the human side of the issue. Because often when we talk about human rights, we focus too much on the rights and we forget about the human side of things. So I like to discuss and present issues from that human perspective. And speaking of human beings, I would like to acknowledge the fact that the materials that I'm presenting to you have been prepared by a law student from McGill named Andrea. I won't name her full name, but and she's done a fantastic work in terms of summarizing the word and also the critique of the word and also the more recent positions of the Human Rights Tribunal in Lubala, in which the Human Rights Tribunal reinterpreted certain rules regarding word. But I'm talking to you today more in terms of the views on the ground, because I think in the end it's about the people who experience hate in different forms that matter. Since I am a Mac person, so does it mean we still push the same button? Okay, sorry. Okay, great. Okay, I would like to present you today a perspective of the victims who come to us for help. I will not be here without them, let me be very clear. In the past, we have helped victims who are targeted or hurt by hate based on race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and some other grounds, including poverty or social condition in the language of the Quebec Charter. And for many of us, especially when those of us who are involved in critical legal analysis, whether it's based on gender, race, or sexual orientation, some of us see, and many of us see, the Ward decision as a dichotomy between the liberals and the conservatives on the bench, especially in what basically is a one-vote majority. A former Supreme Court justice has told me before that on the court you have the civil libertarians, and that you have the equality people, and sometimes it takes one vote to swing either way. So I think that in this case, this is about this, and basically it's about, in the end, it could be an issue of the power and privilege of the majority right to free speech versus the vulnerable minorities' state, and I stress the word state, of equality, security, and dignity, because for a lot of people, rights are too much of an abstract notion, but it's about their own state of security, the state of equality and dignity. And I would like to discuss about the impact of war and how the Quebec Human Rights and Youth Rights Commission decision not to accept a complaint of discriminatory statements outside the employment and service context can have an impact on them. It's not meant as a critique of the Commission, but everything I say is from the view of those who experience it. Because many of them seen as a green light for hate and a red light for effective protection against hate, especially words that are hurt. To us, hate incidents, I hope you understand the distinction between hate crimes and hate incidents, right? We don't need to, hate crimes are basically a violation of any position of the criminal code motivated by hate, whereas a hate incident is anything that is not criminal, but it's still based on hate or contempt and ridicule. Hate is a matter of safety and health, public safety and personal safety, public health and personal health. Increasingly, we are trying to promote the view that a violation of people's rights and condition of security and dignity because of race and gender is also an issue of public health, especially when you're talking about great numbers of people being hurt, such as racial profiling. We're trying to make racial profiling a case of a public safety issue, but also a public health. Come to think about the numbers of people being affected, because the words that hurt and harm psychologically usually lead to harm and hurt physically. And in many cases, we have words precede physical acts or discrimination and harassment, or words that are expressed during the commission of those acts of harassment and violence. So it's always important to keep in mind the very intrinsic link between the words and the actions or the acts, and it's very, very counterproductive when we disassociate hate words from hate deeds or actions. And we have to also think of the disproportionate impact of hate words on those more vulnerable within the vulnerable. I'm talking here specifically about women and children, minors, and also seniors, because we have cases involving harassment. Right now we're helping a gay senior couple who has been exposed to homophobic harassment and hate words, because they are the more vulnerable within the vulnerable. And we tend to forget the disproportionate impact of those words on those vulnerable within the vulnerable. Because in a sense, unfortunately, there's still a hierarchy of hate and a hierarchy of rights. Some hate is more recognized as being hate than others form of hate. And I can talk to you more about that a little bit later. I would like to talk to you about voices on the ground. I believe we have right now a testimony from one of the people who came to us for help. Her name is Isabel Delcid Tobar, and I think she can be connected, and she'll tell you her story. I'll let her tell the story because it's very important for her to do this, because it's therapeutic. She needs to say this to all of you today, to share a story as a way to turn the page on the ordeal that she experienced. Hold on a second. Isabel here is somebody we helped since 2019. Isabel, would you like to, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Thank you very much for being here. So please go ahead. The floor is yours. I mean, the mic is yours. The Zoom is yours.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not familiar with Zoom too, so I'm having a little bit of a difficult time. But today I'd like to share with you my story, my case, which involves the violent arrest of my fiance on March 2018. My fiance, who is of Armenian background, and his appearance maybe Middle Eastern, he was violently arrested by two police officers in the lobby of her condo building. One this morning, he left for school, and sometime after that, I took the elevator down to the lobby. And as I came close to the ground, I could hear people talking very loudly. One voice in particular kept saying, "I wasn't doing anything." When the elevator door opened at the lobby, I saw a police officer bent down on a man with his knee on his back. The man was handcuffed, facing down on the floor. The police officer, despite the man being already on the floor and handcuffs, kept saying, "Stop refusing." I realized that the man on the ground was my partner when I heard him call my name. So I stepped outside and I tried to ask the officer what was happening and why was he on the floor. While I asked these questions, the police officer pushed me very hard on my shoulder and I lost my balance due to that. I asked him a couple of times if he was being arrested, if he was under arrest. He didn't answer to me at first, but he then later said yes, he's being arrested. While this was happening so fast, another officer then rushed to the main entrance door of the lobby and he forced it open. He ran towards me speaking in French, and I told him I couldn't understand what he was saying. I asked him to please speak to me in English. This second officer, as he was running towards me, he pulled out, I think it's called an telescopic baton from his belt. He extended it and he swung it like aggressively in front of me. He also cordoned me by the mailboxes in my condo building. He was very threatening. At this point, I really thought that he was going to hit me with his baton. I started crying. In a panic and a shock, I asked this officer why he was doing that and what was happening. All I was trying to do was understand the situation and why all this was happening. When I asked him these questions, he just looked angrier and he moved his baton closer to my face. During this, I saw the officers forcefully and aggressively drag my partner out of the condo building. And during the arrest, I heard one of the officers say to my partner statements like, "This is Canada, this is not a third world country. We do things like this. We do things differently in here." My partner was released shortly after and was charged with obstructing the police officer's work. My fiance was acquitted 2 years after the police incident. But as an immigrant myself, hearing these comments from a police officer, like, "This is not a third world country, this is Canada, this is what we do things differently here," it really shook me. And it left me concerned by how we are perceived and profiled, regardless of the situation, when we come across police officers. The police officers, they took my partner's ethnicity, appearance, and they assumed him to not be Canadian, foreign, and Middle Eastern, which I think led to the aggressive arrest and the excessive use of force against me and my partner. This experience with police has caused me significant emotional and psychological trauma. I actually had to go through therapy to kind of relieve some of the pain caused by it. I missed work. I felt depressed for a very long time. I developed PTSD. To this day, it still affects the way I carry myself when I come near a police officer. With CAR's help, we filed a complaint with the Quebec Human Rights and Youth Rights Commission because we believe that had my fiance not looked Middle Eastern, he wouldn't have been treated the way he was treated. And that the comments, the discriminatory comments made by the officers were a reflection of the officer's bias. In July of this year, the commission dismissed the complaint because it did not find sufficient evidence of racial profiling or ethnic discrimination in the police treatment of my partner. The commission specifically wrote in the decision that with regards to the discriminatory statements, they believe that they did not meet the criteria as laid out by the Supreme Court in the Ward decision. I think that by this decision, that commission is effectively saying that the officers are allowed to use racist and xenophobic language during an intervention, and that it's okay to do this, no matter how hurtful and unacceptable that language is from a police officer during their work. And this also belittles our dignity, our integrity as human beings. The commission, I feel like, has tolerated police officers' discriminatory and offensive verbal conduct. I don't think that that was the Supreme Court's intention, but the commission said so. My experience with police enforcement and the Human Rights Commission has made me feel disappointed and let down in many ways. It has greatly impacted the way I view personal and public safety and how I feel about the justice system now. The commission didn't find these words to be hurtful or discriminatory. These words influence the excessive force against me and my partner. They diminish the nature and impact of the violent and biased police intervention. I think that hateful and harmful actions often start with words, and they can lead to physical acts of violence and discrimination, and that can be very dangerous. Finally, after going through this experience, I have lost trust and confidence in police enforcement and also in the Human Rights Commission. I think that it's important to hear the victims' voices and feel heard. And to me, I feel like that wasn't given. But I thank you for you today for listening to me and my case and allowing me to share my story. I hope that in the future we see less cases like mine, or that at least officers, are held responsible legally or socially for their excessive use of force and interventions, and also for their racially discriminatory and xenophobic remarks made sometimes in interventions on citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. I just close. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Just 1 minute. I wanted to talk about the impact of Ward because I think it's important to look at it again from the human perspective. Some of the concerns that I have is, and also a lot of people working in the field, will Ward and the way Ward is interpreted, will it lead to proliferation of hurtful insults and jokes, and then a toxic social climate and virtual space? When words are dissociated from deeds, what will it take to be heard? Some people said, look, somebody called me the N-word in a public place. Should I give the guy a punch in the face to be heard, to be taken seriously? Because if I call back a racist word, by the way, you seldom see people of color call white people hurtful words. It's always the opposite, right? Think about it. A lot of men will call women the B word, but you don't see women calling the men some sort of offensive words. So how do we combat hate with hate when hate words that usually precede acts of more serious violation of rights? How do you do that? Do we encourage escalation of words into action in order to be taken seriously, in order to have these things be sanctioned? And what about the erosion of access to justice and effective protection against discrimination and hate-based violence? I think those are the questions we have to do. 2 weeks ago, the Montreal Police released some data on hate crime. It's one of the things that deal with hate incidents, and we refer the cases to crime victims groups, the Human Rights Commission. Then we asked the question to the Montreal Police, are you bouncing the victim from agency to agency because of war? Because look, if victim hate incident going to Human Rights Commission file complaints, and the commission says we don't take complaints based on discriminatory statements as a standalone, so where does that victim go? So we have to be careful with bouncing the victims by giving information that is not up to date or incorrect about their rights and recourses. But more importantly is the loss of faith in the justice system, civil and criminal. And who will pay the price? Again, when you have to think, who are the victims of hate crimes? Who are the victims of hate incidents? The data have been clear. Blacks, Muslims, LGBTQ, women, Jews, and indigenous people. And these are what I call the vulnerable, Supreme Court called discrete minorities. And they bear the brunt. And that's why earlier I talked about free speech. Sometimes it's a power privilege of the majority versus the right of minorities to security, dignity, and security primarily. And when I talk about security, let's think security in physical and psychological terms. Thank you.
And we have a discussant who is a philosopher, Professor Pablo Gilabert, and he would walk us through, I think, some key concepts which are being discussed, but often there is lack of clarity about what we mean when we invoke dignity. And Pablo will help us understand some of these key concepts which inform courts, which inform our commission and tribunals and policymakers and scholars. So Pablo, over to you. He's our discussant for this panel. And we are running short of time. I think we have to finish at 11:30. So, yes, so about 10, 11 minutes.
15's fine.
Okay.
Okay, I have some reflections to share with you about the idea of dignity as the PowerPoint is set up. Is it? So these reflections come from...
they're not going to hear you right now. Just give me 1 second. Let me finish setting up. I can't be in two places at once.
Thank you. So these reflections will come from, not from a legal scholar or a lawyer, which I'm not. They come from a philosopher and a concerned citizen. So take them with a grain of salt. They are very highly tentative, but I'm very excited to share this conversation on these very important themes. So there are 5 things that I expected to do today. I will not do them. There are far too many in the short time that I have. But I want to identify first what seems to be an ambiguity in the use of the idea of dignity in the Quebec Charter and in some international human rights documents. Then I have a proposal about how to understand the concept of dignity to share with you. Then I explore how to use it to address the issues that we are discussing today. So if you look at the Quebec Charter, and you know it better than me, dignity appears in two moments of it, two parts of the Charter. First, in the preamble, where it is affirmed that people have dignity and that their rights are grounded in that dignity. And second, in Section 4, Article 4, in which there is a specific right to dignity that is stated, to the safeguard of dignity. So there seems to be very different, two quite different uses of dignity here. First, as a foundation of rights, and then as the object of a specific right. And these two things may come apart. So it could be that an individual lacks dignity in the second sense because the right to the safeguard of dignity is not being honored or fulfilled or protected, but that person retains their dignity as referred to in the preamble. So it looks like we have this contradictory situation in which someone has and lacks dignity at the same time. This calls for some conceptual work. We have something similar happening in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in other human rights documents. So first, there are a number of very important statements saying that people have, human individuals have an inherent dignity. And you have several examples of that on the first point. Second, there are some statements that seem to say something about in virtue of what people have this status dignity that is referred to in the first point there. And there's some reference to people's features regarding reason, conscience, and the ability to act in a spirit of brotherhood. Then there are some very important claims regarding the relation between dignity and the various rights affirmed in the documents. Importantly, it is said that the human rights are grounded or derived from people's inherent dignity. And then there are a number of very specific remarks about specific rights that people have and dignity features in those statements as well. And again, we have the question about how all these uses of dignity relate to each other. So in my work in philosophy, I try to find a way to render all these references to dignity coherent and illuminating. And I think that it helps to think about dignity as a conceptual network. In fact, there are a number of notions that come under the label of dignity, which are slightly different but tightly connected. And here you have a list of the notions that I identify in what I call the network of the conceptual network of dignity. I will focus on the first five because of time constraints. So take the first three, what I call status dignity, dignitarian norms, and condition dignity. So status dignity, as I see it as a concept referring to a normative, moral, non-conventional, inherent status that people have, in accordance with which they are owed certain kinds of respect and concern. So this is a moral status, it's not a conventional status. Then, of course, you may ask the question, well, what forms of concern and respect are called for? Those would be the ones that we would identify with the second concept, the idea of dignitarian norms. Those are the norms that specify what are the kinds of forms of respect and concern that people are owed because of their moral status as having dignity in the first sense. And when people's claims or dignitarian claims are fulfilled, then we can say they enjoy a different kind of dignity we can call conditioned dignity. So it's important to, I think, to distinguish between these three, and in particular between the first and the third, in order to dissolve some contradictions, like the one I started with. Another example is Steven Pinker in a paper pedantically entitled The Stupidity of Dignity. He says that the notion of dignity is perhaps useless, that we can discard it in favor of some other notions because it leads to incoherence, to contradiction. So people sometimes want to say that because they have dignity, slaves, because they have dignity, individuals may not be enslaved, and when they are enslaved, they lack dignity. So slaves have and lack dignity at the same time, which is a contradiction. But if we make the distinction between status dignity and conditioned dignity, this contradiction dissolves. What slaves lack is conditioned dignity, but what they retain all along is their status dignity. And it's because they have that status dignity that there are dignitarian norms that call all individuals to avoid engaging in something like slavery, so that they gain conditioned dignity as well. So if we make these distinctions, the contradiction dissolves. Fourth component of the network has to do with the idea of basis of dignity, which has to do with what features of individuals give rise to their status dignity. to their moral standing as being with dignity. As I said before, the human rights documents refer to some features such as conscience, reason, the capacity to act in a spirit of brotherhood. But there's an interesting question where that list should be broader, especially to include people with various cognitive disabilities. Perhaps that statement of the basis of dignity that we find in some documents is too narrow. But we need to talk about it. It's a very important dimension of dignity, because without talking about it, we cannot give content to dignitarian norms, because after all, dignitarian norms state the forms of respect and concern that people are owed in virtue of their dignity. But if we don't know what gives rise to their status dignity, we don't know what is it that dignitarian norms would be calling us to respond to. So the next notion of circumstances of dignity, I think, is important too, which has to do with identifying the situations in which dignitarian norms are feasible to implement, but also called for or required. The kind of situation in which human beings are particularly vulnerable to the harms that the dignitarian norms would be responding to. So going to the Quebec Charter, so it seems that the dignity referred to in the preamble is what I call status dignity, right? Whereas the kind of dignity referred to in Article or Section 4 to the safeguard of dignity seems to be dignity in the second sense, or in the third component of the network I mentioned before, that is conditioned dignity. So there are two concepts being used there. It would be interesting that we find a way to make sense of the use of dignity in Section 4 precisely, right? And this is difficult, and the word decision is struggling with that, both sides, and my legal scholar colleagues can explain to us a bit better why they are struggling so much. But it's clear that there is an effort being made to render this section more precise. And it's not obvious how to do that. And it seems that the notion of dignity used in Article 4 must be distinctive. Because in a sense, all the rights in the Charter and all human rights derive from dignity. So in a sense, they are all dignitarian claims. So whenever a right is a fundamental right derived from status dignity, the violation of that right generates a lack of conditioned dignity. So in a way, they are all dignitarian rights. So we could talk about dignity for each one of the specific rights. But why is it that it has to be singled out explicitly for one kind of right? And I think that's the challenge, and it's an interesting and difficult one. So one possibility is that we think about the right being expressed or articulated in Section 4 as linking to a moral right to social recognition for the status dignity of each individual. So what's going on perhaps with this article is that what is called for by it is for a certain set of negative and positive responses on the part of governments and other individuals to the fact that human beings have status dignity, as I referred to before. So there you have a statement of a hypothesis about how to think about this. So we can think about this right to the safeguard of dignity as an individual's rights that through their expressive acts, others do not undermine, and that they protect the individual's effective standing, the recognition, as a human person with a status dignity that gives rise to fundamental rights equal to those of everyone else. So there's something specific going on here which has to do with this expressive affirmation of the status dignity of each individual, which is equal to that of everyone else. That may be worth singling out as a specific point. Why? You may say, why singling this out? After all, people cannot lose their status dignity. So their conditioned dignity may come and go, but their status dignity remains. Why affirm it? Why say that there is a right to the social affirmation of something that cannot be lost? And I think that there could be some arguments to make about this, and would underpin the importance of something like this right. One, of course, that affirmation would be true. So the affirmation that every individual has status dignity, and that status dignity gives rise to fundamental rights which are equal for everyone. Second, yes. There's an issue regarding the psychological impact of the affirmation or denial of the status dignity of each individual, which is something that I think links to what Stéphanie Fournier said before, and also what Mohammed you were saying, and as well the last presentation, and in particular with the issue of self-respect and self-esteem. These are partly empirical claims that they may be relevant in moral argument. So when we are denied status dignity, there's a likelihood that we will lose self-esteem and self-respect. And when we don't have self-esteem and self-respect, it's very hard for us to pursue well-being and to flourish in our personal and social life. Of course, these are empirical links, psychological links, but they may be quite robust for a lot of people. So there may be a point in challenging forms of speech that undermine the conditions of self-esteem and self-respect. Third, there are the social impacts that we may think of. A society that affirms the status dignity of each individual may generate stability for itself. If each individual feels included, each individual will feel more included in a society that firmly identifies them as having status dignity, giving rise to equal fundamental rights. So a society that makes this expressive affirmation of the status dignity of each is a society that is more likely to stay as it is over time. And then there's an argument to be run in terms of the linkage between different rights. So it is common in the literature on human rights to talk about the linkage or lack thereof between the various rights. And and again, empirical issues come in, but they're worth taking into account. It could be that a society that firmly asserts the status dignity of each individual is a society whose members and institutions are more likely to honor the other rights that it enshrines in its main documents. After all, it would be a practical incoherence to tell people, you have status dignity, but I'm not going to honor the rights that follow from it. And on the other, in reverse, a society in which individuals or institutions denied or expressively reject the fact that some of its individuals have status dignity may be a society in which there's less of a likelihood of the specific rights to be justified, to be implemented. I close with this. I'm not here saying that every act of speech could be regulated or curtailed in the name of this kind of dignity I'm referring to here. I'm just saying this is a factor to take into account. What is the weight of this factor depends on the circumstances and on other considerations, including other rights, which are also dignitarian rights. I think the right to free speech is also a dignitarian right. And what Mr. Gray said about chilling effects is something very important to take into account in the balance here as well. I'm just trying to identify hypothetically a specific meaning to this right to the safeguard of dignity. And finally, I conclude this. Some of the responses to protect this right might be legal in civil and criminal law, but some responses might be not legal, may have to do with counter-speech, education, and other forms of action that foster the affirmation, the social recognition of the fact that each individual has status dignity, as I referred to. So the condition dignity people would enjoy would be the one that they would get when they get the social recognition of their status dignity. And that's the main claim. Okay, I stop there. Sorry I went a little bit fast, but
So we actually have, I pushed the agenda forward a little bit so that we would have the opportunity to have some questions. So 10 to 15 minutes, I invite the speakers to come to the front, and we'll start with the third session in 15 minutes, if that's okay, just to give people the opportunity to process a little bit some of what they heard. So I invite everyone to come up, and for those of you who have questions to just be at the podium, please have a seat. Please feel free to put your hand up, and we'll
So please raise your hand and identify yourself, who you are, and ask a question. And you can specify if it's directed to a speaker. So I can.
Is this on? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Hashim. I'm a Max Bell public policy student. Thank you for being here. So my question is about, the fact that there's the harm and then there's the recovery. And so I was curious as to, in the current system that we have, what are the avenues for reparations for victims of those who experienced harm, and maybe where the system actually needs to go if it's not adequate enough in terms of whether it's legal protections or policy.
And is there a person you'd like this to answer,
This
or
could
anyone
just be
could?
anyone in the panel.
So who would? Mohammed.
So, perfect. So before I begin, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the fact that, so my team is here, and in I think in February or so, we're putting together a roundtable for youth to make sure that voices of youth are particularly included in public policy making. So I want to make sure that I mention that so I don't get in trouble later on, and invite all the McGill students here to participate, hopefully in that. I think that covered that for you. And also, before I answer that too, I just want to say, Tuesday is the last day for Marie-Claude Landry as our Canadian Human Rights Commissioner. She's an incredible colleague of ours at the federal level, and I just wanted to, note your incredible tenure, and say thank you for your public service publicly, and because I know what you've done here at the commission is incredible, and I'm just grateful for the partnership. So please give her a round of applause. Yeah. Okay. So the reality is that most people are left behind. It's like that's honestly the reality. I think that some communities have supports where they can assist people to go, what Fo said really eloquently was that allowing her to say her truth is also therapeutic. To be heard and to be understood and felt like someone believes you is actually a form of help. So like having those resources available across this country is incredibly, if we had 50 cars across this country, we would have a significantly better system, because people would have more access to justice than they do right now. In terms of like legal remedies versus, like there has to be more that is being done for victims. And like obviously, like there's a gazillion things that are happening right now in the public policy world, particularly on this is a really big question. Like countries across this world, after Christchurch got together to say how do we deal with this? Media organizations, I think today are meeting with chiefs of police to talk about how do they protect journalists better with the RCMP and chiefs of police across the country today, because there's just not that availability of service. So the outlook is quite dismal. I don't want to sugarcoat it. And I think that until we can start, I feel that until we can start slowing down the pipeline of hateful stuff that's available online, that is polarizing society to a level that never before, that is giving like room for people to be more hurtful and harmful. I think that just the sheer volume of what's coming at us, it's too much for the system to absorb.
So Alia, and then Alia's neighbor.
So my question is for all of you, but particularly for Mr. Hashim. You mentioned that there are police investigations into hate speech and hate crimes, but how do you reconcile or deal with police bodies or police officers being responsible for these investigations while also often being the perpetrators of some of these hate speeches and hate crimes, as we saw with the testimony today?
Well, I'm not going to be standing up here and defending all police for all their actions. That's for sure not going to be the case. But like, look, there are police forces that are really taking hate speech and doing good work on it. I'm not going to negate the work that's being done. Does that mean that all police officers are inherently good? No, I think that there's, people are getting shot by the police. People are getting killed at the hands of police. People are being abused at the hands of police. I'm just wary of painting it all as one brush, because I think that if we do that, the risk is that we leave no room to grow, and the system is broken, right? There's many flaws within the policing system, but I think that and when part of what really stung me from Isabel's is when she said she had lost faith in the institutions, both policing and human rights commissions. I think that's when we lose our belief in democracy. And I think that we got to fight for that. And if we can move things forward incrementally with different players, we have to take that opportunity. So I can't paint that all in one brush.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm a student and I really appreciate the opportunity to learn from all of you. I might direct this question to Mr. Niemi, but anyone else feel free to respond as well, please. I'm just wondering, and this is related to the other questions, what role, if any, does restorative justice play in this? Do you collaborate with people working actively in that field, especially when we're trying to, again, prioritize impact over intent and kind of finding creative ways to address these harms?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that question can be quite, we haven't got there yet in Quebec with the concept of restorative justice for victims of race discrimination or other kinds of discrimination. I just want you to go back to, you remember that video of Joyce Chakwan? Where she was at hospital and all these sort of nasty jokes that made when she was recorded, right? That's the kind of example I'm talking about. How does the family deal with that in terms of trauma? What resources are available? That's something that we have to look at, because when we look at the justice system, it's not just about lawyers and judges. It's also about social workers, psychoeducation professionals, other helping professionals. And this is why we think that social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists need to develop cultural competency. In addition to the fact we need more people from those communities most impacted by hate and discrimination. Right now we have a lot of people, an awful lot of people who are Black, who are Arabic, who experience hate or discrimination, and who need to have social workers or psychologists from their cultural backgrounds. And we don't have enough of that, particularly in English. And in English we have more, but not in French. We don't have that yet. So that's a double challenge, because dealing with trauma is one thing. Dealing with concepts such as restorative justice is something else. I still see that restorative justice is workable or is recognized, particularly with indigenous peoples. But when it comes to racialized or in other communities here, I think the concept is still a little bit foreign to some institutions. So we still have a lot of work to do in order to transcend those cultural and other social barriers towards true restorative justice. And that's something that I think eventually we can have an engagement with judges and other justice officials. I think it'll be very helpful. And please make sure that we can reach out also to professional corporations of social workers and psychologists, because they're really part of that sort of restorative justice apparatus.
Thank you. So if there's a burning question, short, 3 minutes.
Can I
about
answer
3
that
minutes.
quickly?
Yeah.
I was just going to
You
jump.
would like to
yeah,
answer?
Yeah.
Okay, then.
I was going to quickly say that, as Canadians, we get made fun of for saying sorry too often. And some people maybe don't like having to say sorry. I like saying sorry if I did wrong. And I believe in restorative justice. I just think that the scale by which this is happening it's very difficult to do. Restorative justice is extremely expensive. We have some pilot projects, I believe, that we're funding in terms of dealing with hate and restorative justice responses to that. But as Fo said, it's really tricky, and you need the desire of communities to want to engage in that. And sometimes people aren't there.
Thank you. So there were 2 hands. Would you like to go? I saw your hand first. Sorry, maybe you'll go.
Hi, I'm Aftab. I'm one of the students at the Maxwell School. So I wanted to ask briefly about Bill 21 in Quebec, if that's okay. In my opinion, Bill 21 disproportionately affects one social group, Muslim women who are living in Quebec. And you can make an argument that such violates the Equal Rights Amendment of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In such a situation, when the state is using legislation such as this, rather than any form of hate speech, but legislation in itself to target one particular group, what recourse does that group have within the current constitutional framework? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So 2 minutes to answer this question because I don't want to. And then rest over lunch.
Topic of the day. That's why I try to not address it. That's a different. Notwithstanding clause. It's very hard. I think we have to keep on fighting both domestically and internationally in order to point to the fact that, look, the notwithstanding clause has become very archaic, both in Quebec, Bill 21, in Ontario use against unions. I think that it's a democracy, Canadian democracy has evolved in the last 30 years. So we have to find different ways to really put pressure on legislators, both domestically and internationally, not to use the notwithstanding clause except under exceptional circumstances. But right now, I don't see that, and I think we need to keep on pushing. One of the things we need to understand is that I think the reflection award is also the reflection of polarization in Canadian society to the point that we see also in the United States. It's okay now to be very mean and nasty and degrading openly, even towards public officials. So I think it's about the social climate that we have to work on, and collectively have to work to restore, I call it a national culture of human rights. So, sorry, we have to go back to 1948 to recapture the rationale for that Universal Declaration, and we have to really focus on all the international instruments and obligations in order to rebuild, I think, the national culture and human rights that has been fractured, especially in the last 10 years, not because of Trump, but also way back to that reasonable accommodation debates where Islamophobia was very fashionable.
Thank you. So exact 15 minutes. Thank you very much. And I think we'll have occasions to speak to our panelists. So thank you.